Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. Please let me know in the comments where you are watching before we start. We're exploring a tale that history books would have preferred to forget today. A sinister story that travels over the Appalachian Mountains and uncovers mysteries that have been kept hidden for many years. The Appalachian Mountains, with their thick woods and remote valleys, nevertheless harbored deep secrets in the late 19th century. At that time, terror and faith coexisted. Aside, when no one would inquire and entire communities could disappear without a trace. Mary Whitlock, a 36-year-old lady whose story contradicts everything we know about that era, appears in this setting of endless fog and eerie quiet. Mary wasn't your typical individual. She was born in 1857 and lived up close to Asheville, North Carolina, where beliefs from her ancestors coexisted with religious customs. Although not for the reasons we'd like to think, her family was well known in the area. Whispers were heard, rumors, spread from person to person in neighborhood marketplaces and bars. People whispered stories as nightfall started to cover the mountains. Mary Whitlock's dualism was what made her both fascinating and unsettling. During the day, she traveled through the lonely Appalachian communities in a nun's habit, providing spiritual support and prayers to even the most remote residents. However, something shifted when the sun sank behind the mountain tops. At the time, witnesses described actions that were incomprehensible. Behaviors that appeared to be in direct opposition to her purported religious commitment. Mary's fragmented documents can be found in the Buncombe County archives, records that, over the years, were purposefully concealed or destroyed. Letters from local authorities, sheriff's reports, and statements from locals she encountered are what have survived. These records depict a woman who was able to maintain an excellent facade while engaging in behaviors that could never be done in two totally different worlds. Be connected to a religious person. Deep in the mountains, close to the boundary between North Carolina and Tennessee, Mary founded what she called a spiritual retreat in 1893. Access to the site was challenging, as the only paths connecting it twisted between freezing streams and gorges. She asserted that this isolation was essential for reflection and religious practice away from the distractions of contemporary life. However, her closest neighbors, who were located far away, started to notice odd features, lights that glowed early in the morning when everybody ought to have been asleep. Chants that seemed to come from an unknown liturgy could be heard resonating through the valleys. Passengers in the area requested refuge, but were never heard from again. At first, people thought that these stories were the result of the mountain people's vivid imagination and the legends that had long plagued these old places. However, after a well-known Knoxville, Tennessee businessman vanished after stating he was passing by Mary's land, authorities started to pay attention. William Patterson, the Sevier County Sheriff, made the decision to conduct his own investigation. On a soggy October afternoon in 1894, he assembled 3 deputies and rode to the mountain shelter. What they discovered there would alter the community's understanding of what might be concealed beneath the cover of religion for all time. It wasn't until 1962 that Patterson wrote in his personal journal on the place's ineffable oppressive atmosphere. Mary's residence was a simple structure from the outside, a ordinary wooden home with a tiny chapel attached. Yet there were unsettling inconsistencies inside. Religious emblems mixed with incomprehensible items. Books that were inappropriate for the average individual to possess. Manuscripts written in languages Patterson was unable to recognize. Then there was the basement, which was far larger than the cabins outside suggested. We have to realize that the law operated extremely differently in those days. They didn't. The forensic tools available to us now. Authorities frequently relied only on testimony and visible evidence, and there was a lack of quick communication between counties. The specifics of what Patterson and his team discovered in that cellar were never fully disclosed in official records, but it was enough to have him order Mary Whitlock's immediate arrest. In an effort to prevent the community from learning about certain facts, several portions of the case were purposefully kept under wraps. Mary was placed under arrest. However, for reasons that are still unknown, her detention lasted less than 72 hours. Before a trial could begin, she was able to break out of the county jail. Some claim that she had internal support and that powerful individuals were looking out for her best interests. Others think she secured her freedom through unconventional means. The truth is that no one has been able to locate Mary Whitlock since she vanished into the Appalachian Mountains like smoke on a breeze. The months that followed Mary Whitlock's unrest that swept through the Appalachian area like a quiet fire marked the disappearances. Weeks of searches were coordinated by Sheriff Patterson, who explored abandoned paths and deep caverns that penetrated the mountains. Every expedition came back empty-handed, and the men who took part in these searches came back altered, their eyes averted and reluctant to discuss what they had seen in those old forests. The Asheville residents started disseminating disjointed reports about in December of 1894. Although the publications were circumspect, they alluded to unsettling findings regarding the mountain retreat while withholding specifics. Thomas Brennan, a journalist, visited the location and produced a number of reports that generated controversy in North Carolina and the surrounding states. He characterized the site as a location where natural laws seemed to no longer apply and normalcy looked suspended. Numerous locals were interviewed by Brennan, and their accounts created an eerie patchwork. An old woman, called Agnes Morrow, who lived roughly 5 miles away from the sanctuary, claimed that Mary had been coming to her house on a regular basis for years, always bearing prayers and healing herbs. Mary had always struck Agnes as kind and gentle, and she couldn't fathom the same person engaging in such sinister endeavors. However, she also acknowledged that Mary's gaze had a certain intensity that occasionally unnerved her, as though she were being assessed in some kind. Jacob, a farmer, provided another statement. Hensley, who said that one hard winter night he met Mary at a crossroads. He observed her standing in the center of the road, immobile as a statue, on his way home from a vacation to Johnson City, Tennessee. Jacob claimed that he offered her a ride, but Mary only silently observed him before vanishing into the forest's shadows. The following morning, as he visited the same location, he saw unexplainable inscriptions on the ground, patterns carved into the frozen ground that created intricate, geometric designs. Religious leaders also started to voice their opinions. In an official declaration, the bishop of the Asheville diocese said that Mary Whitlock's religious practice was a total hoax and that she had never been legally professed as a nun. She had no actual affiliation with the Catholic Church. She had just accepted that vestment. Many people who had trusted her throughout the years were surprised by this news. Individuals who had confided in her about their most personal suffering, thinking they were in the company of an authentic emissary of the religion. However, the question that afflicted everyone was both straightforward and unsolvable. What had Mary Whitlock done in that remote haven? The official records are incredibly lacking. Though nothing detailed enough to provide a clear picture, there are references to unsettling artifacts, obscure texts, and evidence pointing to actions that are incompatible with Christian beliefs. There seems to have been a tacit agreement among those who knew the truth, a conspiracy of silence, to never fully disclose it. The case reappeared in the press in February 1895 due to an odd incident. In western North Carolina, a family of German immigrants reported seeing a woman who fit Mary's description close to their home. According to reports, she showed up 3 nights in a row, usually at the same time, watching the house from a distance without getting close. When Friedrich Weber, the family patriarch, chose to face her on the 4th night, Mary just vanished as though she hadn't been there. When other local families started reporting similar encounters, the Webers' story acquired credibility. Mary appeared to be wandering about the area, frequently staying in the shadows, watching, but never engaging. Some conjectured that she was trying to create a new haven, looking for a place even farther away where she could carry on with her activities unhindered. Others said she was only waiting for the attention of the authorities to fade before returning to her old life. Sheriff Patterson stepped up the search, but it was all but pointless due to the size of the Appalachians. Thousands of square miles of thick forest, unreachable mountains, uncharted caverns, and valleys with little to no sunshine are all included. If someone was determined to stay concealed, they could simply live off the land and stay away from all forms of civilization for as long as they wanted. Over the years, Mary Whitlock had proven that she was quite knowledgeable about surviving in the mountains. The sightings increased in frequency and intensity in the spring of 1895. According to a Methodist preacher called Elijah Crawford, Mary was first seen in the early morning hours of his own church in Boone, North Carolina. She was seated in the back pew, her face hidden by the cowl of her habit, when he arrived early to prepare his Sunday sermon. Crawford claimed that he experienced a chill down his spine and began to doubt his own faith due to a feeling of an evil presence. She was gone when he blinked, and the only sound in the deserted hallway was the sound of footsteps. In remote Appalachian villages, these stories fostered a climate of terror. People started to be wary of strangers, avoid traveling at night, and lock their doors more securely. It became increasingly apparent that Mary was something more than a typical criminal evading justice, something that didn't fit neatly into any one category. Her narrative was used by local pastors to illustrate the perils of fake piety, of how evil can pass for righteousness. The whole case was resurrected in June of that year when a team of hunters found something close to the French Broad River. They discovered the ruins of a burned-out building tucked away in a deep valley that was only reachable by a scarcely discernible trail. Items that were obviously Mary's, such as a rosary of black beads that multiple witnesses had mentioned in their testimonies, were among the debris. However, the fire was so fierce that all that was left was ash and burned pieces. More questions than answers were raised when the burned corpses were found in the French Broad River Valley. After personally inspecting the scene, Sheriff Patterson concluded that the fire had started at least 2 weeks prior to the hunters' discovery. The ferocity of the flames indicated that the devastation was intentional and methodical, rather than the result of chance. Someone had deliberately set fire to the building, destroying any evidence or possibly carrying out a last rite before permanently leaving the area. Investigators discovered partially preserved pieces of paper and book pages that had amazingly survived the fire among the debris. One of these pieces ended up in the possession of Theodore Ashworth, a scholar who specialized in ancient texts and unusual manuscripts and was a professor of classics at the University of North Carolina. Ashworth examined these burned pieces for weeks, attempting to interpret the words that remained readable. He was extremely troubled by what he found. It seems that the sentences were a combination of Latin from the Middle Ages and other languages Ashworth was unable to correctly identify. The activities he had only come across in very old documents, treatises that the Catholic Church had attempted to repress for centuries were mentioned. In a private report to the authorities, Ashworth suggested that Mary Whitlock had exceptional understanding of esoteric customs from pre-Christian times. She seemed to have access to a hidden library of prohibited information. In the meantime, sporadic reports of Mary's presence persisted over the Appalachian region. She was reportedly spotted in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, a tiny town on the Great Smoky Mountain slopes, in July of 1895. Samuel Dockery, a local blacksmith, claimed to have seen her at the market, purchasing supplies as though she were a regular person. She vanished into the crowd with an agility that seemed unattainable for someone dressed in heavy religious robes as he attempted to approach her to verify her identification. The case of Mary Whitlock started to draw interest from outside the Appalachian region. Newspapers about the enigmatic nun who had tricked entire communities appeared in Richmond, Virginia, and even as far away as Louisville, Kentucky. By fusing reality and fiction, some sensationalist authors started crafting even more complex stories that elevated Mary to the status of a nearly legendary character. Since it was now hard to tell the difference between real and fake accounts, the authorities' job became even more challenging. A terrible incident occurred in September, gave the probe a fresh sense of urgency. Near Blowing Rock, North Carolina, a 24-year-old lady named Helena Pritchard was discovered lost and wandering the streets, unable to provide an explanation for her whereabouts over the previous 5 days. She couldn't construct logical statements, and she was shocked and famished. Helena's story astonished everyone when she was able to talk again. When her horse went lame while traveling, she said a nun approached her and offered to help. The nun asked her to take a nap in a nearby hut, offering to feed and tend to the animal. Helena accepted the invitation, believing the woman to be devout. Her recall of what transpired next was fuzzy, as though she had spent whole days in an unsettling dream. She remembered floating and falling at the same time, lights pulsating in hypnotic rhythms, and chants in alien tongues. Helena was unable to explain how she had arrived at Blowing Rock when she eventually managed to flee or was set free. Her final distinct recollection was of being at the cabin, and the next was waking up miles away on the side of the road, unsure of how she had managed to get there. When the doctor examined her, he noticed odd marks on her ankles and wrists, suggesting that she had been bound for a while. However, Helena had no recollection of opposition or escape attempts. The investigation was drastically altered by Helena Pritchard's testimony. She was no longer just someone engaged in dubious activities or a religious fake. There was now proof that Mary was deliberately looking for victims, enticing susceptible individuals into circumstances from which they would find it difficult to flee. Sheriff Patterson sent out warnings across the area, specifically cautioning women who are traveling not to put their faith in strangers, regardless of their religious affiliation. The fear this news caused in the remote Appalachian towns is beyond our comprehension. People were already terrified of the mountain's inherent hazards, the bears and panthers that prowled the woods, and the unexpected storms that could trap them. Journeyers in dangerous canyons. There was also a new, more pernicious fear that evil may take on the most innocent aspect, masking its terrible aims with religious symbols. Another similar incident was reported in October 1895. This time it was a middle-aged guy called Robert Caldwell, a businessman from Knoxville who was discovered close to Hot Springs, North Carolina, after going missing for 8 days. He was confused and unable to articulate what had transpired, just like Helena. He recalled accepting a lonely nun's hospitality, drinking anything she offered, and then experiencing just jumbled sensations and visions. The pattern was starting to emerge. Mary Whitlock was still in the vicinity. She was still working in the dark, was always on the go, creating makeshift shelters and seducing gullible people. What was her ultimate objective, though? Why did she detain these individuals for days before letting them go? More significantly, how many additional victims were present who were never discovered, who disappeared altogether? Authorities from several counties started arranging joint searches, exchanging information, and coordinating operations. Sheriffs and deputies built a telegraph-based communication network to share alerts about suspicious encounters. In the Appalachian region, posters depicting Mary were displayed in churches, post offices, and bars. A $500 reward was offered for information that led to her apprehension. A substantial amount at the time, but Mary consistently appeared to, ahead of the game. She had already relocated each time the authorities approached. She seemed to have a network of informants who alerted her to the whereabouts of law enforcement. Or maybe she just knew the mountain so well that she could smell danger before it materialized. She had made a personal castle out of the natural maze that was the Appalachians. The Appalachians saw an exceptionally harsh winter in 1895. Roads were blocked by blizzards and whole. Communities for several weeks. When even the most seasoned trackers realized that it was impossible to traverse the deep, snow-covered mountains, the hunt for Mary Whitlock was put on hold for a while. It seemed as though nature had banded together to keep her safe, erecting an unbreakable wall between her and her assailants. Something unexpected occurred during these chilly, quiet months. Sighting reports stopped altogether. Mary was not mentioned in any of the counties in the area. Others started to conjecture that she had died in the harsh winter weather, which was nature's way of doing what the authorities had not been able to accomplish. Some thought she had run west, over the mountains to Kentucky or possibly far off Missouri, where she may continue her activities in uncharted terrain, while others thought there was a third, more unsettling possibility. Maybe, deep in the mountains, Mary had discovered the ideal hiding spot where she could spend the winter alone and wait for everyone to forget about her. The ancient caverns abound throughout the Appalachians, some of which were large enough to support entire towns. There were many tales of hermits residing among these rock formations for decades. The first people to walk the mountain routes reported disturbing finds when spring finally came in 1896, bringing thaws and a resurgence of greenery. Symbols were carved onto rocks and trees in several places spanning hundreds of kilometers. These were purposeful, intentional markings, creating patterns that some identified as resembling those in Mary's initial haven. She left traces of her presence all over the mountain range, as if she had spent the winter marking her territory. These symbols piqued the curiosity of Nathaniel Green, a Presbyterian clergyman who frequently conducted religious services in remote Appalachian towns. He started recording every mark he came across, meticulously sketching them in a notebook and noting their precise positions. Green became aware that the symbols weren't dispersed at random. They created a sort of network connecting particular points across the mountains as he plotted their placements. Green presented Sheriff Patterson with his research, speculating that Mary might be attempting to convey a message by using these symbols or designating places that had particular significance for her. In order to explore the locations that Green had determined to be essential to this enigmatic network, Patterson planned excursions. At these sites, they discovered everything from nothing at all to tiny caches holding personal items and food. Proof that Mary had, in fact, set up several makeshift havens around the area. Something really unsettling was found at one such location that was found in May 1896, close to Grandfather Mountain. It was a naturally occurring cave that had been altered and had simple constructions inside. There were indications that it had been occupied for weeks, maybe months. The drawings on the cave walls, however, drew the greatest interest. Complicated. Pictures made with natural pigments that showed sceneries that were hard to understand. Human figures were shown in the paintings in a variety of positions. Some seemed to be in anguish, while others were in joy. A female figure in what seemed to be a religious habit was in the center of it all, surrounded by symbols that most definitely didn't belong to any Christian tradition. There were also depictions of the sun and moon in particular locations, implying some kind of calendar or timestamp system. Mary seems to be attempting to leave a legacy of herself. Convictions, or maybe a road plan of her goals. Once more, Professor Ashworth was called in to study the paintings. He studied every aspect of the cave for 3 days, taking notes and sketches. His next report was even more unsettling than the one before it. Ashworth found that what seemed to be Native American knowledge was combined with aspects of European pagan customs, which had been outlawed by the Church in the Middle Ages. It was a remarkable fusion of several religious systems, as though Mary had spent years researching various esoteric systems. As milder weather arrived, sightings started to increase again. In June, a family passing through the Linville Gorge area claimed to have spotted a nun-dressed woman observing them from a nearby cliff. After standing still for a few minutes, she vanished into the trees. Similar stories started to come in from various Appalachian regions, but they consistently followed the same pattern. Mary would make fleeting appearances, letting others see her but never approaching, enough to be apprehended. These sightings had an intentional quality. She seemed to want people to know that she was still alive, and that she hadn't run away or died. This was seen by some as a direct challenge to the authorities and a sign of arrogance. Some perceived it as a warning, a means of maintaining the community's terror, while others conjectured that Mary was attempting to convey something more nuanced, that her appearances adhered to a logic that no one could fully comprehend. That year, in August then, there was an event that almost led to Mary's arrest. One of the miners, Patrick O'Brien, noticed smoke coming from a nearby ravine as they were working a modest operation close to Spruce Pine, North Carolina. O'Brien and 3 friends agreed to look into it since they thought it might be Mary's camp. In silence, they moved through the trees until they were in a position to see where the smoke was coming from. Yes, that was Mary Whitlock. She was. Sitting by a tiny fire, she appeared to be fully at ease and unconcerned. For a few minutes the miners observed, strategizing how to encircle her without her realizing and fleeing. Then, however, an extraordinary event occurred. Mary raised her head and peered straight at their hiding place, which was obscured by the foliage and quite a distance away. O'Brien subsequently characterized her smile as both calm and profoundly unsettling, prior to the miners. Able to respond, Mary put out the fire surprisingly quickly and started to ascend the gully with nearly unachievable dexterity. She went through the thick flora and boulders as if she knew every path and every stone, even though the soldiers were chasing her. She vanished entirely in a matter of minutes, leaving her pursuers perplexed and worn out, wondering how a 39-year-old could move over the tough terrain with such ease. A developing belief among those pursuing Mary Whitlock was strengthened by the episode involving the miners at Spruce Pine. She was not only intelligent or fortunate, but also endowed with powers that were inexplicable. An almost magical aura started to surround her as a result of repeated stories that she could sense approaching people, navigate over impassable terrain, and just vanish when trapped. Many guys simply refused to take part in the search because they were afraid of encountering something they didn't understand, which made the authorities' job much more challenging. Investigative tactics underwent a dramatic change in the fall of 1896. Sheriff. After realizing that traditional approaches were failing, Patterson made the decision to try something new. He started looking at sighting patterns, the locations of symbols that Pastor Green had recorded, and the testimonies of victims who had been set free. Patterson was meticulous, spending weeks poring over intricate maps of the region and annotating each pertinent location with colored pins. Slowly, a pattern started to take shape. The locations where Mary had been spotted appeared to form a kind of circuit across the mountains, rather than being haphazard. She traveled in a predictable pattern, going back to specific locations on a regular basis. Patterson observed that these motions appeared to be in sync with seasonal shifts and moon phases. Mary seemed to be according to her own calendar, one that was dictated by the elements rather than by human customs. With this knowledge in hand, Patterson was able to forecast Mary's next anticipated appearance. He covertly placed observers at key locations in a particular area close to Rand Mountain in late October. On the boundary between Tennessee and North Carolina, they were seasoned hunters and mountain men who understood how to be patient and undetectable. They remained silent for days, keeping an eye out for any indication of activity. One of the watchers noted activity on the night of October 28th during the new moon, when it was nearly completely black. He had noticed a dim glow tracing an old path that few people were aware of through the forest. After being informed right away, Patterson rallied his men, but this time he had clear instructions. Not to try to catch her in the act, but just to track her down and find her. Although it was a risky approach, since Mary might realize she was being followed, Patterson thought it was more important to understand her base of operations than to make another unsuccessful effort at arrest. Patterson's men tracked Mary's movements across the highlands for 3 nights in a row, always keeping a safe distance. She seemed to be going on a pilgrimage of some kind, stopping at particular places and staying there for different periods of time before continuing. At each site, she carried out tasks that were difficult for onlookers to completely understand from a distance, such as setting up stones, starting tiny fires, and spending extended periods of quiet silence. Mary eventually made her way back to what seemed to be her main hiding spot on the 4th night. High atop Rand Mountain, it was a complicated rock formation that was challenging for even seasoned climbers to reach. There was a space accessible through a small opening between 2 big boulders, protected from the rain and wind. After meticulously marking the place, the scouts went back to report to Patterson, who started organizing a coordinated investigation. Patterson made the decision to hold off on opening an investigation until there was convincing proof that Mary had left her hiding place. He didn't want to run the danger of her escaping through another direct confrontation. They kept a close eye on the area for 2 weeks, working observation shifts to make sure nothing went unnoticed. It was a time of intense anxiety as the likelihood that Mary would learn of the surveillance and leave her hiding spot grew with each day. The chance finally came in the middle of November. Mary was seen carrying a bag and obviously ready for a longer journey as she descended the mountain toward the valley. Patterson and 6 men ascended to the rock formation after she had safely left. The most important hints about Mary Whitlock's actual activities to date came from what they discovered in that refuge. Between the rocks, there had been changed into an unexpectedly ornate home. There were partitions made of wood, a sleeping place furnished with furs and blankets, a kitchen, and, most significantly, a whole section dedicated to what could only be called a laboratory and library. Mary had amassed dozens of books, many of which were old books that appeared to have been obtained in some mysterious way. Additionally, there were jars filled with different materials, meticulously categorized dried plants, and tools whose function was not instantly apparent. Before it was taken out, Patterson mandated that everything be recorded. His men drew the layout of the refuge, took thorough notes, and spent hours cataloging every item. A diary kept by Mary herself was one of the items discovered. Pages and pages of dense text in handwriting that is elegant but challenging to read. The diary was written in a variety of languages that none of the team could recognize, including English and Latin. Once more, Professor Ashworth was called upon to review the complete gathering of resources. What he discovered captivated him completely. Herbology, alchemy, natural philosophy, and treatises on mystical traditions from different cultures were among the subjects covered in Mary's books. She was actively experimenting and formulating her own theories, as evidenced by the marginal notes that showed she had read these texts. Mary Whitlock was obviously a highly knowledgeable, self-taught scholar. Unsuspected facets of her personality were exposed by the diary. Mary's writing style was clear and eloquent voice, considering her life, decisions, and convictions. She characterized her journey as an attempt to gain insight beyond the constraints placed on women in her era by society. She disapproved of traditional religious institutions because she felt they limited people's ability to connect with more profound natural forces, not because she detested spirituality. Mary listed the individuals she had met over the years in her notes, including those who were later cited as victims. Her account of these encounters, however, differed greatly from the official narratives. Through techniques involving medicinal plants, extended meditation, and particular rituals, she claimed to have provided transformative experiences and chances to transcend ordinary consciousness. She saw herself as giving gifts rather than doing harm. Professor Ashworth and the authorities were faced with a philosophical conundrum after reading Mary Whitlock's diary. According to what she said, someone who sincerely thought she was performing significant spiritual work by providing people with experiences that the general public rejected. However, it was still true that her acts had terrorized people, that people had been detained against their will, and that entire families were afraid of running into her on the remote roads of Appalachia. The actual effects of her actions were unaffected by her perceived intent. Ashworth interpreted and translated the texts discovered at the refuge over the course of several weeks. Mary had developed a complex belief, he found out, a system that blended practices she claimed to have learned from mountain healers, elements of medieval European mysticism, and even knowledge passed down from indigenous peoples who had lived in these areas prior to colonization. She wrote about the necessity of re-establishing humanity's connection to the natural cycles that modernity had forgotten. In a particularly insightful passage, Mary explained that she chose to become a nun as a sign of commitment to a spiritual path that went beyond particular religious beliefs rather than as a fraud. Denominations. She believed that she belonged to a long line of wise women who had been suppressed historically. The habit served as both a declaration and a disguise, allowing her to move freely within society while indicating her detachment from it. The hunt for Mary went on as Ashworth dug into her writings. There was a new complication, though. Mary would undoubtedly learn that her primary haven had been discovered and pillaged. Patterson accurately anticipated that this would increase her prudence and unpredictability. No sightings were reported for weeks following the discovery. She seemed to have just blended in with the mountains, becoming a part of the natural environment. All search efforts were halted by the harsh winter of 1896-1897. However, Patterson made a different use of the winter months this time. He personally traveled to every Appalachian community, conversing with local healers, elders, and residents of even the most isolated places. He was attempting to comprehend not just Mary's, maybe, as well as how she had learned it, who might have instructed her, and whether she was collaborating with others. These discussions unveiled an unexpected aspect of the narrative. A number of senior citizens acknowledged that they had known Mary for a lot longer than the official records indicated. Living alone in a cabin close to Beech Mountain, Esther McKinney disclosed that she had known Mary when she was much younger, probably in her early 20s. Mary had already shown an unusual interest in medicinal plants by that point, and conventional methods of healing. Mary, according to Esther, had traveled through the mountains for years in search of people who were still holding on to ancient knowledge. She spent months studying under various masters, taking in everything they had to teach her because she was so eager to learn. According to Esther, she has an unquenchable thirst for knowledge and is prepared to live in dangerous circumstances and endure any adversity in order to gain wisdom. There was nothing dark about those formative years, just an incredibly resolute young lady. Over time, however, something had changed. Tester was unable to determine the precise time, but Mary started to stray from conventional healing methods and venture into more sinister areas sometime in the 1880s. She started to wonder about the boundaries of human awareness, how to create altered states of perception, and what was out there beyond the boundaries of everyday reality. The course of her research started to cause discomfort for the traditional healers. An additional source, a male. Something even more fascinating was disclosed by Isaiah Watts, a man who had spent decades working as a tracker and guide in the mountains. Mary didn't work all by herself, he said. At least 2 or 3 other individuals, both male and female, occasionally helped her with her tasks. Watts had seen them a few times over the years on his own treks through the isolated trails, but they stayed to themselves, staying in the shadows. This discovery fundamentally altered the investigation's focus. If Mary had accomplishments at that time, the operational network was much more intricate than anyone had anticipated. With this fresh viewpoint, Patterson started going over all of the earlier cases, searching for trends that might point to the existence of several individuals collaborating. He discovered a number of contradictions in accounts that now made more sense when other people were included. A dramatic incident in the spring of 1897 gave the case new urgency. Margaret Foster, age 32, vanished while traveling from Asheville to her hometown, in North Carolina's Marshall. Searches were set up along the whole path she would have taken after her family reported her missing right away. Margaret was nowhere to be found for 5 terrifying days. On the 6th day, she was located by a search party close to the French Broad River, not far from the location of Mary's first burned-out refuge, which had been recovered years before. Margaret was still alive, but her health was concerning. She suffered from great mental confusion, dehydration, and tremendous weakness. She was transported right away to a Marshall doctor, where she recuperated physically for days before being able to articulate what had happened. When Margaret was at last ready to tell her story, she told how a woman dressed in religious garb approached her and offered to assist her when her carriage broke down. Margaret trusted the woman's devout appearance, much like numerous victims before her. She was shown what she described as a partially subterranean building carved out of the mountain itself. There, she was housed in a tiny room with minimal food and water. Margaret's mention of several voices was the most unsettling aspect of her story. Though she only ever saw the woman in the robe, she was positive that she heard at least 3 other individuals conversing someplace above her. Low-pitched voices argued, sometimes in English and other times in languages Margaret didn't understand. She felt as though she was being watched, as though she were a subject in an experiment, the work of Margaret Foster. Patterson's suspicions regarding the presence of accomplices were validated by the testimony. In order to find these other people who were collaborating with Mary Whitlock in the background, the inquiry had to be expanded. In order to gather information about any suspicious people who might be linked to unexplained behavior in the mountains, Patterson dispatched telegrams to sheriffs in nearby counties. As responses started to come in, each one added a tiny piece to the intricate puzzle. Charles Whitmore, a guy who served as Madison County Sheriff, revealed stories about a small group of folks who would sometimes show up at wintertime hot springs. They were reserved people who made bulk purchases of food but never disclosed where they were. They always paid with gold coins, which was rare for the area at the time, and were regarded by local merchants as kind yet distant. Nobody was aware of their true names or their origins. A fortuitous incident in June 1897 yielded the first tangible hint as to who one of Mary's accomplices was: a deputy. While on patrol close to Waynesville, North Carolina, a guy named Frank Collier came across a camper in a secluded location. There was something about the man's manner that set off Collier's instincts, and he was neatly dressed, which was odd for someone camping alone in the mountains. When asked what he was doing, the man said he was David Carmichael, a naturalist who was researching the area plants. He had equipment to back up his story, which appeared credible. His assertion, including notebooks containing intricate drawings of plants. As Collier was ready to release him, he spotted a black beaded rosary among the man's possessions, that was the exact replica of the one discovered in Mary's first burned-out sanctuary. Collier kept his doubts to himself and maintained his composure. He spent a few more minutes informally conversing with Carmichael, trying to learn more about his whereabouts throughout the previous weeks. Collier gave him a warm farewell, went back to the city right after, and sent an urgent Patterson via telegram. A meticulously planned operation to find and watch Carmichael without warning him was put in place within a day. Discreet squads trailed Carmichael across the highlands for a week. At first glance, he seemed to be making scientific observations and gathering botanical specimens. However, he behaved differently when he thought he was by himself. In order to communicate clearly, he would go to certain places and leave tiny items in hollow trees or beneath rocks. With other people, he was keeping up a signal system, leaving messages to be picked up later. Patterson made the decision that it was time to face Carmichael head-on. Carmichael was camped next to a creek on the slopes of Cold Mountain one afternoon in late June when Patterson and 4 men approached him. Carmichael did not protest, but he also did not appear surprised, as though he had been anticipating this moment. He didn't say anything when he was taken into jail, not even confirming his name or responding to any queries. Carmichael's possessions were carefully inspected. Along with the authentic botanical materials, there were also coded letters, maps with symbols resembling those in Mary's refuges, and a tiny diary with only characters and numbers that seemed to be at random. It was evident that Carmichael was an integral part of Mary's operations, rather than just a casual aide. His coding system's complexity indicated a high level of formal knowledge. Carmichael was detained in the county jail for days while authorities made an effort to identify him. He had no official paperwork with him, and they couldn't find any records with the name David Carmichael. His exact identity was only discovered after a missing person complaint from Virginia 2 years prior. In reality, he was Jonathan Merrick, a natural philosophy professor who had quit his job at the University of Virginia in 1895. Records from the institution show that Merrick had been a well-known academic with a focus on medical plants and how they are used. Colleagues, however, said that he had grown more and more fixated on secret knowledge and esoteric customs, ultimately embarrassing the organization with his unconventional beliefs. He never came back to the institution after leaving on his own volition, saying he wanted to do field work. Months later, his family filed a missing persons report, but until then, no one knew where he was. Mary Whitlock and Jonathan Merrick's relationship started to take shape through. Among their possessions was ancient correspondence. Years before, they had met, presumably through alternative knowledge-seeking fringe academic groups. Merrick's knowledge of Bodhi and natural chemistry was the reason Mary had expressly sought him out. What started out as an intellectual exchange had developed into a more profound alliance, with both parties exchanging knowledge and a worldview that went against the prevailing social mores. Eventually, Merrick started talking, but he did so cautiously and in a restricted way. He acknowledged working with Mary, but maintained that their actions were not well understood. He said that by combining medicinal plants with meditation techniques, they were investigating the boundaries of human consciousness. According to his interpretation, the individuals who had been identified as victims were voluntarily participating individuals who were merely unaware of the severity of the experiences they would go through. Given the condition in which other victims had been discovered, Patterson didn't fully accept this story. However, Merrick's remarks provide crucial background. Instead of viewing themselves as criminals, Mary and her friends saw themselves as trailblazers, venturing into unknown human experience. This view of themselves made them even more dangerous because they showed no regret or recognition of the damage they had inflicted. At first, Merrick's arrest was kept a secret in the hopes that Mary would attempt to get in touch with him without realizing he had been apprehended. in the hopes that Mary or someone else would set up monitoring at the places where Merrick had left messages Patterson. An accomplice would arrive to verify the signals. Nothing happened for weeks. The places were unaltered. The messages were not gathered. The network as a whole seemed to have realized the threat and just vanished. Another member of the gang was discovered in August 1897, although under sad circumstances this time. A body was discovered in the mountains close to Asheville, close to Craigie Gardens. She was a woman in her 40s who had been hurt in a fall and appeared to have died from exposure. Among her possessions were letters that linked her to Mary Whitlock directly. Before going missing in 1893, Rebecca Thorne worked as a nurse in Richmond, Virginia. The passing of Rebecca Thorne provided fresh insight into the characteristics of the organization functioning in Appalachia's shadow. The letters that were discovered with her death showed that she was a bright, hard-working lady who had given up a prestigious career to pursue what she called a deeper truth than conventional medicine allows us to reach. She described Mary in her writing with deep respect, describing her as a spiritual mentor and instructor. It was evident that Mary had a great deal of power over her followers. Examining Rebecca's correspondence, Professor Ashworth observed that her references and vocabulary aligned with then-emerging philosophical tendencies in both Europe and the U.S. There were thoughts about re-establishing a connection with ancestral wisdom, theories regarding the evolution of human consciousness, and echoes of transcendentalism. Mary had successfully combined various intellectual currents into a cohesive vision that appealed to idealistic, educated people who felt cut off from the quickly evolving industrial society. Patterson started to realize she wasn't just dealing with a single criminal. Rather, she was dealing with someone who had started a movement, albeit a small and covert one. Those who joined Mary were not gullible or susceptible to manipulation. Rather, they were people who had deliberately chosen to give up traditional lives. As a result, the morally more complicated, but it didn't alter the reality that innocent victims had endured the repercussions of actions they had never agreed to. An unanticipated development occurred in the fall of that year. Jonathan Merrick became gravely ill while still in jail pending trial. A serious fever that swiftly progressed to pneumonia was identified by the prison doctor. Despite receiving the greatest care possible, Merrick passed away in September 1897, taking many of the group's operational secrets with him. In his last moments of lucidity, he delivered a single, unmistakable sentence to the guards. This would end in the mountains, she always knew. Rebecca was the only known member of Mary's group still alive and free after Merrick's death and the earlier finding of her body. Patterson conjectured that there might be further, as of yet undiscovered, accomplices, but the months that passed with no suspicious activity raised the possibility that the circle was smaller than they thought, or that Mary had finally recognized the noose was closing in and made the decision to completely shut down her business. In the winter of 1897-1898, an extraordinary event took place. Across the Appalachian region, not a single sighting of Mary Whitlock was reported for the first time in years. No travelers vanished inexplicably. There were no people in religious garb watching villages from a distance. There were no new symbols discovered engraved on stones or trees. It seemed as though she had finally left, or that she had died in the harsh mountains, as some people started to suspect. The land was renewed in the spring of 1898, yet there was still a sense of mystery that persisted. Although authorities continued to monitor the case, Patterson never gave up on it entirely. In the constant search for that piece of information that would ultimately expose Mary Whitlock's fate, he kept collecting information and interviewing people who came to the mountains from other areas. A gang of men, known as ginseng hunters, spent weeks in the most isolated parts of the Himalayas in May of that year, looking for the precious. Rode came back with a fascinating tale. In a remote location close to Grandfather Mountain's summit, they had discovered what looked to be an abandoned campground. If one of their dogs hadn't smelt something and demanded to investigate, they would have simply gone by the spot because it was so well concealed. Built with significant expertise to blend in with the natural surroundings, the camp was simple yet functional. There were indications that it had been occupied for months or even longer. However, the fact that everything had been left in a neat, almost ceremonial manner was the most striking feature. A small mound of precisely balanced stones served as a kind of sign or memorial in the middle of the objects, which were arranged in predetermined patterns. As soon as Patterson was told, he went to the location himself. He recognized a number of items right away as belonging to Mary, including a book that had been listed in her first refuge's inventory. However, there was a certain finality to the scene, a feeling of completion. It appeared to be a purposeful farewell, rather than just another short-term hiding spot from which she intended to return. In an effort to find any clue as to Mary's whereabouts, Patterson authorized thorough inspections of the surrounding region. Miles of difficult terrain were covered during the weeks-long search. Teams trekked trails that had not been used for decades, discovered caverns, and climbed treacherous gorges. In June 1898, they uncovered a discovery during one of these explorations that ultimately brought the Mary Whitlock case some measure of resolution, albeit not in the manner that anyone had anticipated. Human remains were found in a deep cave in a particularly isolated area of Grandfather Mountain by a team under the direction of seasoned tracker Samuel Hutchkins. Accessing the cave was very challenging, involving negotiating tight spaces and scaling perilous rocks. Although it was hard to identify the bones precisely due to their state, there was compelling circumstantial evidence indicating they was Mary Whitlock's property. The religious habit she normally wore was meticulously folded next to the bones, as though it had been taken out and put there on purpose. A last piece of writing was also preserved from the dampness of the cave in a metal jar. The letter was dated April 1898 and was written by Mary herself. In it, Mary described how her journey had come to an end and that the mountains, which had served as her haven, would now be her last resting place. Mary Whitlock's last. The clarity of her writing and the quality of her reflections made this letter exceptional. She admitted that she had lived outside the norms of acceptable society and that there would undoubtedly be repercussions. But she did not apologize for any acts that the authorities deemed criminal. Mary described her life as an unrelenting quest for information that traditional establishments denied to nonconformists, particularly women in her time. She talked about growing up in Asheville, the daughter of a family that prioritized looks over content. Mary had experienced a significant gap between what she truly wanted to pursue and what was expected of her from an early age. Her basic concerns regarding the essence of human life were not addressed by the answers provided by organized religion. She had looked for alternatives in antiquated writings, discussions with disenfranchised intellectuals, and customs that persisted outside the purview of official history. Professor Ashworth examined the letter for days, comparing the handwriting with further known Mary documents to verify its legitimacy. It was real, he decided, probably penned a few weeks before she passed away. The human remains were consistent with a lady of Mary's age and build, notwithstanding limitations imposed by the forensic techniques available at the time. The most plausible explanation was that she had retreated far into the mountains she knew so well, and selected this isolated cave as her last resting place. But there was still a troubling question. Was her death unintentional or natural? There was no definitive response in the letter. Mary wrote of going back to the ground and finishing the cycle, which may be seen as a sign of intentionality or as a philosophical acceptance of mortality. The skeleton showed no signs of physical violence, but after spending so much time in underground conditions, it was also impossible to pinpoint the precise cause of death. Patterson made the decision to regard the discovery as the case's official resolution. Mary Whitlock had passed away. Her well-known. Additionally, accomplices had died, and no other unusual activity in the mountains had been reported. The entire inquiry from 1894 to that time was documented in a thorough final report that the sheriff put together. Until contemporary historians started re-examining the case, the report was mostly ignored for decades after it was recorded in the county records. However, Mary Whitlock was not quickly forgotten in Appalachian communities. Her tale was handed down through local tradition and told over campfires, passed down through the generations. The facts were extended and corrupted over time, as is the case with all legends. She was portrayed as a misunderstood martyr in some versions and as a blatant villain in others. As is frequently the case, the reality was in a more complicated place than any straightforward story could adequately convey. Several of the individuals who had been detained by Mary eventually provided more mature thoughts on their experiences in the years after the case was officially concluded. Some claimed to have been the victims of manipulation and kidnapping. Curiously, some people developed more conflicted viewpoints. Helena Pritchard, the young lady who had been among the first victims to be identified, was one such individual. Helena, who was already married and residing in Knoxville, interviewed a journalist in 1902 while she was preparing a retrospective on infamous cases from the previous century. She disclosed that even though the occurrence had been horrifying at the time, years of introspection had caused her to doubt her own recollection of what had happened. Helena acknowledged that there were times of extreme clarity and insights that drastically altered her perspective on the world, but she also acknowledged that certain aspects of the experience remained hazy. Helena's testimony's uncertainty revealed a larger aspect of Mary Whitlock's legacy. She had worked in morally dubious environments, combining aspects of sincere spiritual inquiry with techniques that went against consent and personal autonomy. Her behavior was not acceptable, but it also couldn't be explained by straightforward malice. Mary stood for something that society at the time was ill-equipped to comprehend. A woman who tried, albeit in a problematic way, to establish alternatives to the positions that were open to her. For the remainder of his academic career, Professor Ashworth kept researching Mary's legacy. He wrote a scholarly paper about the case in 1908, emphasizing its philosophical and intellectual elements above its criminal ones. The article caused a great deal of debate. A few. Others defended the need of attempting to comprehend complex motivations, rather than merely condemning, while colleagues accused him of romanticizing a criminal. Over the ensuing decades, the scholarly discussion surrounding Mary Whitlock persisted intermittently. Scholars from every generation contributed fresh viewpoints, analyzing her acts in light of their own historical settings. Feminists of the early 20th century viewed her as a radical illustration of a woman defying patriarchal norms. Alternative education scholars. She was situated within the marginalized mystical traditions of religious groups. Her use of herbs and psychotropic substances was investigated by medical historians. For the residents of the Appalachian Mountains, however, Mary was largely a spectral figure, a warning about the perils that can exist even in the most hallowed locations. Children were cautioned by their parents not to put their confidence in strangers, even if they were wearing religious symbols. The image of the lone nun in the mountains turned into an archetype of deceitful looks and danger in disguise. Interest in the case was rekindled in 1962 after Sheriff Patterson's private journal was found during remodeling at the former county jail. Private thoughts that Patterson had never included in his formal reports were found in the diary. He talked about his own uncertainties and concerns, as well as restless evenings spent wondering if he had fully grasped what Mary Whitlock stood for. In his personal writings, Patterson acknowledged that there was a part of him that liked her bravery in living totally outside all conventional norms, despite the fact that he admitted her activities had actually hurt people. As decades stretched into centuries, the public's awareness of Mary Whitlock's story progressively diminished, leaving only the scattered memories of mountain towns and dusty archives. Nature recovered the areas where she had set up her havens, and the buildings crumbled and grew over until they blended in with the surroundings. The paths modern roads that cut through the mountains with uncaring efficiency, have replaced the routes that were once traversed with such intimacy. However, an unforeseen incident in 1973 brought the matter back into the public eye. Uncharted rooms were found by a party of cavers exploring Grandfather Mountain. They discovered wall paintings in one of these subterranean chambers that were very similar to those recorded at Mary's Refuge in 1896. The finding sparked a more extensive scientific investigation that uncovered an intricate web of interconnected caves, some of which show signs of human habitation from various historical eras. Objects that were obviously late 19th century were among this evidence. Scraps of paper with writing that was too deteriorated to fully interpret, pieces of cloth that may have been part of a religious habit, and the remnants of handcrafted candles. Mary had delved far further into these caves than anyone had thought, according to archaeologists who studied the site. That she was knowledgeable about underground systems that extended under the mountains for miles. A troubling new possibility was brought to light by this research. What if Mary Whitlock's wasn't the person whose remains were discovered in 1898? What if, while fleeing down the depths of the tunnels to begin anew somewhere far away, she had staged her own death and left behind strong evidence? Although the notion was improbable, it was not completely out of the question due to the intricacy of the cave system. It would never be possible to verify it with certainty, and this uncertainty only enhanced the mystery surrounding her story. Mary Whitlock's case is positioned by contemporary historians as part of a larger group of 19th century women who defied social conventions. Although her tactics were undoubtedly more drastic than others, she was not the only one to rebel against restrictions. There was a secret history of women pursuing knowledge that was prohibited, investigating spirituality outside of recognized religious institutions, and trying to establish areas of independence within a community that consistently disregarded their goals. Mary is especially remarkable because of not just what she accomplished, but also how she was able to function for such a long time in the shadows. She recognized that the Appalachian topography presented special opportunities for people who were prepared to accept hardship and seclusion. Using deep caverns and isolated valleys as test sites for her human consciousness research, she transformed the mountains into allies. Before contemporary surveillance and fast communication, it was feasible to totally vanish if one was familiar enough with the area. However, we also need to acknowledge that Mary actually inflicted pain on those who declined to take part in her adventures, regardless of her philosophical or spiritual intentions. Mary's vision came at a terrible cost to the victims who were detained against their will and lost days or weeks of their lives in a condition of terror and uncertainty. Unaware of the whereabouts of their loved ones, their families lived in agony. Communities as a whole were changed by enduring terror. Mary Whitlock's legacy is still quite unclear. Was she a predator or a visionary? An astute manipulator or a spiritual seeker? The most truthful response would likely be that she possessed aspects of each of them at the same time. A complicated individual whose behavior defies simple classification as either good or evil. She lived during a period of profound change when new possibilities were emerging and long-held beliefs were being challenged. In reaction to this momentous occasion, she forged her own route, utterly rejecting the choices that civilization presented. It's difficult to avoid feeling the presence of all the stories those old mountains have to tell when we visit the Appalachian Mountains today. Generations of humanity have traversed the deep valleys and dense forests, each leaving an imperceptible imprint on the terrain. Thousands of people, including Mary Whitlock, sought safety in the mountains from persecution, poverty, or just the pressures of society. However, her tale stands out for the ferocity of her vision and the unwavering tenacity with which she pursued it. Researchers in local libraries and historical groups can still access the files that detail her case. The guys who pursued her are depicted in old photos wearing formal, somber attire. Maps show the places where she was spotted and where her hiding places were found. However, no paper can adequately convey Mary Whitlock's personality, motivations, or aspirations to accomplish through her deeds in the mountain shadows. Her story's most unsettling element may be the way it makes us face difficult issues like personal liberty versus group safety, as well as where to draw the boundary between healthy spiritual inquiry and destructive manipulation. Mary refused to accept the legitimacy of these boundaries and lived entirely outside of them. As a result of her refusal, she spent the rest of her life alone in a cave, cut off from all human society. However, she survived. Few of us can truly say that she lived by her own convictions all the way to the end. Beneath stone and woodland, the Appalachian Mountains still conceal layers upon layers of human history. Hikers still occasionally discover the foundations of long-gone cabins or odd symbols etched into old trees. Every new finding serves as a reminder that the past is never quite gone, and that it continues to reverberate through time in ways that we are only now starting to understand. The narrative of the Appalachian Nun, Mary Whitlock, who was too wicked to be recorded in history books, but it nevertheless serves as a reminder of the complexity of human nature and the mysteries that still exist in old mountains. She serves as a reminder that some people have made and still make decisions that are drastically at odds with societal norms, and that these decisions have long-lasting effects. If you've been intrigued by this exploration of one of the most unsettling and mysterious cases in American history, if you are considering the intricacies of morality and unsolved mysteries we've investigated together, you might want to subscribe to the channel. There are a ton of additional sinister tales that are just waiting to be shared. Instances that should be remembered but have been left out of official history. Tell us what you think about Mary Whitlock in a comment. Did she choose her own terrible destiny, or was she a victim of her times? Your viewpoint is important, and I would be interested in knowing what you think. Additionally, if you know someone who enjoys real historical mysteries and tales that share this video to defy simple classification. Explore the shadows of the past until the next time.